Hello everybody, my name is Jeremy, this is Red Beans Recording. This video today is about using visualization tools to help you make sense of other people's music and make better choices in your music. Taking the visual information of pieces of music that maybe you want to sound like and being able to use your eyes and your ears together to make better decisions about your mixes and your arrangements. This is something that I show people a lot in my lessons, and someone online was asking for help with, how do I visualize how to make my mixes sound like mixes that I want to sound like? And I'm like, well, I know about that. So here's a video about that. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to look at the tools that you probably have access to already and some that maybe you might want to buy that can help you learn so much about how music is constructed and then take that information and put it into your own songs. All right, so let's start off with a basic house track and start off with a tool that you absolutely have access to, and that is an EQ, specifically an EQ with any kind of spectral analysis. In Ableton, we have the EQ8, and I'm going to go ahead and click the little button to make it bigger. And this is going to give us our first tool and the most accessible one that all y'all probably have access to. Hey, Editing Jeremy here. Before we get too deep into this next section, let me make a quick but important clarification. I'm going to be talking about the decibel levels marked in this EQ. And I don't want you to think that these are the decibel levels that represent where your signal actually is at. Someone I sent this to was like, you're talking about 12 dB and 7 dB, but I thought I was only supposed to mix to 0 dB. And yeah, you generally don't want to clip over 0 dB unless you are purposely trying to clip a circuit or push some kind of analog distortion. The way this EQ looks is that it's marking the amount of decibels that you can move an EQ point to. So you can increase a band or cut a band by 12 dB. It's a kind of a confusing situation, and I didn't realize that until after I shot the video. But basically, when we look at this EQ and I say, hey, the kick and the bass are here at 12 dB, that's simply just a number in the EQ. It doesn't mean they actually are at 12 dB. What we're really trying to do here is use this tool to examine the visual relationships between things like kick and bass, as opposed to getting definitive measurements of them. We'll actually do that a bit later with another tool. All right, I hope that makes sense. Thanks. We have a pretty standard house beat. So one thing that people have a lot of trouble with is the placement of their kicks and their bass. How do they know how much bass they're supposed to have in their tracks? Where should their bass be in the track versus where their kick fundamental should be? Where should their kick fundamental be? And we can look at that very, very easily here. I can just take a really simple, super steep low pass and move it all the way down. I'd say probably around, let's see, we're going to go around 100. That's where I can hear the bass and the kick. What you are going to find is like different genres have a different placements of their bass and sub bass. And we'll look at a drum and bass track after this because it's very, very different. But what we're going to get here is information about the kick, sub, and the bass itself. Now, something that is important to know when you're looking at this stuff is, what's bass and what is sub? Well, sub is this down here. See, our kick sub peaks around 42.6 hertz. That's where it ends up, and around 11.7 dB. That is something that we can use as, I'm going to say 12 dB. That's something we can use as a sort of guide for our kick. If I bring this up, we'll hear more. And then we start getting into bass territory, which is right around here, probably. Sub bass, and then bass is actually up here. So what can we see about our bass here? Well, where it lives, it's hitting probably around, well, it's actually almost hitting the 12 dB mark that the kick drum is. And that is something that you can bring to your mix. You can say, okay, if I'm trying to have this sort of funky walking bass line kind of thing, and I have a kick that hits around here, if my bass line lives a little bit higher, as opposed to like maybe hitting the subs quite as hard, then I can have it around 12 dB in this track in general. As we move up the frequency spectrum, frequencies get more easy to perceive and become perceivable faster and sort of more intensely. So what that means is when you look at a final mix, you'll generally see a downward trajectory of frequencies like this, where the bass frequencies, at least in dance music and a lot of pop music, the bass frequencies are always going to be really, really high. And as we go up, those frequencies start to look like they lose power in decibels. And technically they do, but what's actually happening there is they are becoming more perceivable by us, and we will hear them more than we'll hear bass frequencies at a higher decibel. There's a psychoacoustic effect that happens. So in general, if you put your bass frequencies up a little bit, or have the bass live up in the 100s or something like that, or maybe have a layer, then the bass is going to be much more perceived than if it's just a sub bass. So with this, we can detect, see the peaks of the bass right here, and where the kick is. So here's what this track sounds like without any EQ. Sort of a deep house kind of track. So we can see that our kick is right around here, and our bass kind of like is a little atonal. It's more like a sort of like almost percussive bass, and it's living right up around there in the same amount. If you go all the way down here, just in case you saw that weird little jump here, you can hear that like it is primarily just the sub of the kick that's down there. So just with an EQ, you can hyper-focus in on certain frequencies and get a sense of what they're doing visually in terms of like, should your kick and your bass be like matched a certain way, and sonically. I'll show you what I mean about this match thing real quick. So I'm going to pick out a loop for a kick and a bass, and I'm going to go ahead and use the EQ to bring it down. And then I'll bring the bass up to where I think it should live in relation to the kick as we listen to it through the EQ. All right, so I have my loops here. Let's go ahead and bring down our... So our kick is hitting around 36.9 hertz, 37 hertz at 8.62. We'll call it 9 dB just for ease of use. So that's not quite as important here as just using your ears to get the bass to come up and interact around that same amount in the visualizer. So let's go ahead and do that. We know that we're like in the sub and bass area here. Let's start bringing this bass up. What you sort of want to feel in this situation is that like you're outside the club, maybe outside of a car or in another room where only the bass is traveling to you. That actually is useful information to have in your sort of sense memory, because that information is what the low end of a track sounds like when filtered like down like this. So that's too much. I think that's pretty good right there. So let's bring the EQ up now and hear what the rest of the loop sounds like now that we've had it interact with itself like this. Yeah, that sounds really good to me. The kick and the bass are working together. The bass should really be like a sort of lighter percussion version of the kick that also provides the tonal floor. So by doing it this way, we are able to really zero in on the transient relationship and tonal relationship of the bass and the kick. Now, we didn't do any side chaining here. That's something that you can also see through various means, and I'll show you that in a bit. Let's look at a drum and bass track through this method, and then we'll move on to some other tools. All right, so what we have here is a liquid drum and bass track with a really classic low respace. So let's go ahead and do our thing. We'll take our EQ and bring it down. All right, so when that bass kick drops out, we really get to see where the kick really is, right there in those little breaks. So keep an eye out for when the kick stops and the bass stops. Right there. So we can see that the kick is sort of this round thing right here that kind of insinuates underneath the bass. Drum and bass is one of the few genres that I've seen, aside from maybe rock in some cases, and maybe like much more organic music where the control over the bass frequencies isn't quite as like insane and surgical, where the sub bass will go below the kick of the bass. And as you can see, here is our sub right here around 44 hertz. And you can see its first harmonic right here. So, or first order harmonics, excuse me. And so we can see that the sub is actually hotter than the kick and lower than the kick. And we can also see that it's being sidechained because we can see that little thing drop right here. Boop, 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 boop. Every time the kick comes in. There's other ways that we can see that sidechain information, but if you know what to look for and you're ever wondering, should I sidechain my bass? Does this track need a sidechain? This will tell you that. So here we have an example of a track where the kick is a little softer than the bass, but it is sidechaining the bass. So that's another thing. Let me find a more neuro sort of drum and bass track real quick, and we'll take a look at it through here. All right, here's this awesome track by DJ Science. God, I love drum and bass. It just makes me happy every single time I hear a track. All right. Not surprisingly, this looks really, really similar. We've got the, there goes, whoop. We've got this sub here that has a couple harmonics we can see. And there's our kick right there. You can see that the sub reaches up just a little bit more than the kick, but it is getting sidechained as well. So we're learning something about how drum and bass is constructed versus how house music is constructed. So something that's really important when you're trying to reference your track against a reference track that's been mixed and mastered is that you match the loudness of the two tracks. So we're going to do that using a LUFS meter. LUFS or LKFS are a weighted integrated loudness measurement that was designed for keeping commercials not louder than broadcast signals. And it's something that we can use to measure our mixes against other mixes. So there's a couple things that do this. I use Ozone Insight, and there's a free one out there called the Julian loudness meter, I believe. So what we're going to do is put Insight on our master channel here. And I'm just going to go get a random reference track that will not match this in terms of loudness. All right, so here is an unmastered track. Now I'm going to match the output volumes over here. And what I'm going to do is first solo my track and see what its loudness is. All right, so mine is around -15, we'll call it. And then theirs is around -8. So I'm going to use the gain right here to bring this down until it sits -15. Cool, that's good enough. -15 and -15. So basically you can just turn a track down until it hits the loudness measurement that you want. And so now going into this next process, I know that if I was to match loudness of, let's say, the bass frequencies from my track to this track, that I'd be making that in a proper context and not trying to match the like crazy mastered version of the reference track. Let's move on to another tool that I really like to use, and that is sort of in conjunction with this. A lot of what I like to do is separate frequency bands from each other to get a sense of what's going on in that frequency band. And that could be a visual thing, that could be a stereo imaging thing, there's all kinds. So I'm going to combine two tools that I like because I don't want this video to be super, super long. The first one is a multiband compressor, and I use this to split the bands out. So I'm going to use my Ozone 11 multiband compressor here. And I'm also going to use an imager with this. So this is a stereo imager. So we're going to use these two in conjunction with each other. Let's go ahead and get some audio in here first. So with this, what we want to do, and this is the reason I use the Ozone stuff for this, is because I can click up here like this, and then I can hit learn and learn, and it's going to create crossover points for me for these 4 band splits. I'm going to go ahead and reduce any compression happening here. All right, so what can we learn from this? Well, it's similar to the last thing. If I solo this band, I get access to the low frequencies in a hearing way, an oral way, I guess. Don't just ignore this clipping stuff over here. It doesn't really mean anything right now. But what I can also learn about this is over here, this information where it says peak and RMS. I'm going to go to my I/O and change RMS to integrated. So what this tells me here is that our low end for this track is around 11.9 or 12 LUFS. LUFS units are a loudness measurement that is integrated over time, meaning it takes a measurement over time, and it is weighted in a certain frequency way for the human ear. We talked about how higher frequencies are more perceivable to us earlier. That's part of what's going on here. But what this tells me here is that the low end of this track is a certain loudness. And we know, since we matched the loudness of our reference track to our mix, that we could use this value as a target for our low end if we wanted to get our low end to feel like this track, but we'll also have to go and match the other bands too. The other thing we can see down here is our stereo information. This is really, really important. I don't know if people really take stereo information into account when they're trying to get a good polished sounding mix, but it's incredibly important. How do tracks use stereo information, and where is that stereo information living? I found that a lot of electronic music kind of does an inverted V, in which it's not very stereo on the bottom, and then it's very stereo at the top, and much more hazy and diffused on top in terms of its transients. So as you can see with this track, our low end is virtually mono. There's a little tiny bit of flare up there at the end of one of those bass hits, but for the most part, it's pretty centered. Let's go to our mid-range. Now, all of a sudden, a lot more information comes into here, and we also get a lot more stereo information. If we click over here, we can reset our LUFS meter, and we'll see what we hit at here. So this band is not as loud as the bass band. This is around -15 LUFS. Move up here. All right, this is an incredibly important band right here. This is where a lot of the clarity and presence of music lives. So looking down at our thing here, we can see that there's a lot of stereo information, and see how it's sort of like, that's the right way to put it. It's kind of diffused. There's a lot of little individual dots. I'll show you what a non-diffused stereo image looks like in a smidge, but this is really important. If your mix doesn't have this sort of diffused look to it here, and instead is very, very spiky, then you're going to have like a pretty fatiguing transient experience. So I'm always looking for ways to kind of soften and stereoize and manage my transients in music. And the reason I've done that is because I can look at this stereo image here, and I can see that there's no direct spikes. Here's what a direct spike, just panned mono hi-hat looks like in this. Okay, this is what a mono piece of audio looks like. See how it's just a complete spike right there. So if I was to pan this, see how it's just a narrow spike that moves around like that? We generally want to avoid those in our mixes. Diffusion, however, looks like this. See how it sort of starts to get a little wiggly and dotty? Now, I wouldn't recommend that you use 400% width on the Ableton utility. There's lots of other ways that you can get width out of individual elements in your tracks, and I do believe that you should be applying it to individual elements and groups, especially frequency dependent. But yeah, that's just what a mono signal looks like. Let's get back to the thing. All right, and then finally, up to here. Interestingly, this is not quite what I would have expected from this track, but it is diffused, not super spiky, and we're hitting it around... It's not even pulling the LUFS up. You could use something like the Ulian loudness meter or Ozone Insight after this chain, and you would get a loudness thickness. Oh, we're getting one now. It said like around -23. So maybe about there. All right, let's take a look at a drum and bass track. So what we're going to do here is hit learn again, because you want the proper crossover points. And generally you want to play the part of the mix that has like the most information going on. Nothing we can lose. I got pockets full of no money we can use. All right, the stereo image on this track is insane. Let's go with our low end. So what I like to look for with drum and bass tracks is whether or not they ever bust out any like crazy little stereo whomps, because sometimes they will. Mid-temp music like Res will do that a lot, where you'll have like bass note, bass note, bass note, big stereo bass note. So keep an eye out for that. Our low end here is rather well managed in terms of stereo image. So the stereo image is going to get insane as we go up. Yeah, even in here in the low mids and mids, here's where all the stereo information really starts to come up. So you can keep an eye on some of the bass sounds here. Yeah, like that, like, kind of busted out a little bit. So let's go up to here. Insane stereo image. Now you'll notice over here, this is something I always look for, we're still in positive phase. We never hit 0 or go to negative phase. Oh, we did, just for a tiny second. What that means is if you hit negative phase, it means that if your mix was sum to mono, the left and right would cancel each other out just a tiny bit in some cases, or 100%. If you put two sine waves completely out of phase and pan them left and right and then squish that down to mono, the signal will go away completely. So generally, we want to avoid, when we're making our tracks from scratch, we want to avoid negative phase. I feel like it can happen sometimes in the real world naturally. So it's not something I like completely avoid all the time, but it is something that I keep an eye on when I'm mixing individual parts. And up here, see how it's just all fuzz. This is what I was talking about with that inverted pyramid, just all fuzz up here and very soft transients. If you put too much transient information in these really, really high bands, then you end up making the mix almost impossible to listen to. So always think about fuzzing your high ends. The other thing you can do while you're doing this is listen to the balance of instruments that are occurring in these individual bands. This is a aural and visual process. You want to be able to hear what's in an individual band and start to recognize what might be there, and especially if you're using headphones, what it feels like against your headphones. I use sound pressure level against my ears all the time in making mix decisions, and that's because I kind of know, after doing this a bunch, what should be in an individual band. So when you're doing this, really pay attention to how things hit your ears and try to like remember that as a sense memory. Like, where is the snare here compared to the vocal? You can hear how forward the drums are in this mix compared to some of the rest of the stuff. So a lot of information can be seen. So we can see, first of all, what our crossover points are, like what are the major bands of this. We can check our LUFS levels for each band, and we can use a vector scope to see what the stereo image of a band looks like and whether or not we should be adding or subtracting stereo information from a band to make the track feel a certain way. Because the stereo information and the sound pressure levels and the transients, that's all what the mix is. It's the structure of the mix. So we've been doing a lot of beat-driven music. Let's do an ambient track through this process really quick because it's going to be very different. Mixes with no drums get to follow a whole different set of rules. You'll notice when we split our bands up here that we really don't have a sub band much anymore. It's 60 and below. And look at our stereo image. It is dripping back and forth under 0. So if we monoize this, we've technically probably lost some audio information from that negative phase. But let's check out our individual bands. So our mid-range band is wild, right? You can see there's a very heavy leftward bent, and then every once in a while we'll get that sound that pops over on the right there, and you'll see our stereo image try to go over there. But like everything down here is just massively stereo. Our mid-range band, very soft, but following a similar thing, but just look at how like diffused this is. This is part of the reason this music feels so good to be in, is because it's got this wonderful womb-like stereo image. And then up here, there are these really terrible little spikes. Those, ugh, don't like those at all. But in context, they're not terrible. So, very, very different experience when dealing with ambient music. I got one more tool to show you. I hope this video isn't too long. Next up is a very, very cool tool from a producer that knows what they're doing. This is Vision 4X, and it was made by Noisia, if I remember correctly, who is a very, very talented producer. This is a really interesting plugin in that we need to get it on grid. So let's get a track going on. I'm going to start with some drum and bass because Noisia. God, I love drum and bass. Let's take a look at this section right here. This right here, this little downward comma, this is our kick. So what we can see here is that the kick has a little bit of pitch drop to it. That's what this is. Broop. It goes poof. And it has a little high frequency attack that goes all the way up here, along with the snare. Here's the snare. The snare bottoms out at around 400, maybe a little lower than 400, and has a big high frequency representation. One of the things I see people make a mistake with drum and bass versus like maybe the different subgenres of drum and bass, is that they won't get their snare high enough or low enough to help the genre work. Certain drum and bass tracks, they'll have their snare down here at like 200 to give it like a really big body. So things like Sub Focus's tracks or like really hard drum and bass, maybe like Jump Up Styles, will have a snare that hits down at like 200 as opposed to this little snappy snare, which bottoms out at 400. So perfect visual representation of what's going on. Do you see this smearing right here? This means that the bass is being sidechained around the kick. So you can see here, the bass drum hits and the bass itself goes away. That's a sidechain. So if you wanted to know how long your sidechain should be, you can get a sense of it right here. You can also see that the bass is sidechained around the snare. See how the bass disappears around the snare? I didn't know that. See how there's a primary bass right here, the sub bass? We can see that it goes below the kick right here, right? Like here's the main frequency and then it drops below that. Our kick tops out around, or excuse me, bottoms out right around here. Something interesting else that you can see is, how is this bass constructed? This is, for the most part, I'd call this like a noisy blasted sine wave bass. So we have our sub, and then we have these harmonics here, right? They all hit with the bass. Those are the upper harmonics that give the bass that noisy kind of This little thing right here is that broom that hits at the end of the fill. Right? All right. So what can we get from this? Well, we can start to understand a few things. One, transient information. How long is our kick? Where does it bottom out? How does the bass relate to it? Does the bass have upper harmonics or is it just a sub? Mostly it's going to have some form of upper harmonics. Where's the snare bottom out? Around 400. And let's see if we can find a different part of this mix. Upside down, run this town. I'm going to play this build-up part into the drop, and we're going to look at a few things. Upside down, run this town, chop it now, we've got nothing to lose. All right, let's stop it here. So see this? This is a sub bass, but it's nowhere near as bright as our previous bass. So we know that there is a bass line in here, and there's a kick, but it's, again, sidechain still, but it's nowhere near as loud as our previous scene drop area, and that's to be expected. You want to create the energy and create the movement, but you don't want to give away the full fidelity of your drop itself. Otherwise, it won't hit very hard. Our build up. And there we go. We can compare our drop kick here and our bass versus the kick and bass that was in the build up. So it's really, really cool. There's so much information that you can, if you know what you're looking for, you can just pull out of these visualization tools. So there are some other really, really cool views that we can use in this. This is not the only view. We do get a frequency response. We get a rather useless vector scope down here. But if we go to our settings, we get a whole bunch of different things. So we can go to harmonic mixing. This is really cool. So what this is a visual version of that. Remember how we were talking about using LUFS for per band to get a sense of where we should match things in terms of loudness for each band. This is a target sort of like band for different genres. If we go down here to our reference, we'll be able to choose different types of music. We can't put our own in like you can with tonal reference, whatever from Isotope. But if I go to like drum and bass hard or drum and bass deep, I guess, we can see where we might need to match in order to get our track to fit into a particular vibe. So that's really, really useful. Low end focus. This is just the bass. You can really see the relationship between where the sub is compared to where the kick is here. Super, super useful if you want to know, like, hey, where's the bass in this track? Like, where's it living? Here's a piece of music that I wrote for an RPG campaign. And I'm going to go here to transcription, and we'll see. We can get a really, really good sense of what the individual notes are. If I hover over these, you can see down here, it'll tell me what the notes are. So we could loop a part of this and use this to help us transcribe a piece of music if we wanted to. All right, well, that's my spiel on visualizers for music to Box of Doom, who wanted to know about this stuff online. I hope this helps you. If you have any questions, hit me up on Telegram. For the rest of you, I also hope it helps you. This is something that I really like to show people in my lessons, and now I maybe don't have to because you'll be able to experience it yourself. If this was helpful to you, leave a like, leave a comment, really helps out. This channel is kind of in a weird place in terms of views versus subscribers, and I'm just like to know that you still like the content and are still around for that kind of shit. All right. Thanks for watching. My name is Jeremy. This is Red Beans Recording, and I hope you have a wonderful day.